Hi all, I'm just going to make a little video about the pelvic tilt that we use as a basis for movement in our classes. So this can be a tricky little movement. It's one that does need a little bit of conscious connection and a bit of cognitive thought. So I just want to give you some tips or tricks to help you out if you want to practice some of these throughout the week before some of the classes. Alrighty, so I'm just going to come back onto the mat and we'll start in lying. Okay. So just a couple of things about the pelvis before we start. So the pelvis is a basin shaped bony structure, very complex and really cool structure. So it connects your upper body to your lower body, and it has loads and loads of muscle connections, muscles from the upper thigh, from the abdomen, from the back muscles and the bum muscles and your hamstring muscles, and also your pelvic floor muscles. So it forms that basis of the cylinder of our core. So our core is made up of muscles from the top, bottom, back and front. So the top of our core is a diaphragm muscle. The floor of our core section is our pelvic floor muscle that goes from the back and the front to the front of our pelvis. The front of our core are our tummy muscles, and the back of our core is made up of our back muscles and bum muscles. So it's like a cylinder unit, and even more recently people are talking about the vocal cords being the top of that cylinder unit that makes up the core of our body. So if pressure is built up anywhere, like if we're excessively pulling in or excessively arching, then pressure can either irritate the vocal cords or the pelvic floor muscles. So if you're pulling in that cylinder unit loads and arching the back loads, then there'll be a pressure downward onto that pelvic floor and it can cause issues there. If you're pulling in a lot as well, we spoke about in the class, it affects your diaphragm movement, so it kind of splints your diaphragm into that high up position, so you can't expand the lungs and take a nice long slow breath and fill in the bases of the lung. So being able to move the pelvis is really nice because it causes nice dynamics around the core area. So I'm going to start lying down, and then I'm going to move into different positions to be able to move that pelvis so you know what you're doing. Okay, so let's get into the lying position. And I always place a little towel underneath my head, not underneath the base of the head, not into the nape of the neck. So you've got that long spine as you start. You can bend the knees, that they're in line with your hips, and your knees roughly in line, or your feet roughly in line with your hips as well. So just taking a couple of belly breaths here before we start. So breathing in, belly rise, breathing out, belly fall, breathing in, belly rises, breathing out, belly fall. So just thinking about your pelvis connected to your low back. So you can use your hands for a little bit of feedback as well as it slips into the top of your sacrum or into your lower back area. And you're just going to tilt the tailbone forward. The bottom muscles stay close to the floor, stay attached to the floor. And see, can you slide your hand in? And you should feel a little gap. Then you're going to reverse that. So your pelvis tilts forward or backward, excuse me. As it tilts backward, your low back communicates with the mat or kisses the mat, so your hands shouldn't be able to slide in so much. I'm just going to take my hands out of the way so you see that. So I'm going to arch my back so my pelvis bone tips forward. Okay, so imagine that basin is tipping forward, and I can slide in my hand there. You can see that arch, and then I'm going to tip my pelvis back so my low back connects with the mat. And the tailbone is tipped forward, and then you're going to arch again, so your tailbone or your pelvis tips forward. So that's my pelvis bone there, it's just tipping forward, arch, and then reverse. My pelvis bone tips backward, tipping forward. I create a gap and an arch in my back so you can see, and as I tip backwards and always breathing, that gap closes down. Okay, so this is important because when we start to do our sit-ups, you want the pelvis to be roughly tilted back, so your low back is communicating with the mat, and that activates the core at the front. So when we go to do a sit-up, I always start with a little pelvic tilt forward and reverse, so you're just kissing the mat, and then we'll lift the head and shoulders off the mat and back down. I don't want you starting from an arched position. It's really hard and it can only strain the neck. Okay, so watching that again, tip the pelvis back, kisses the mat, and that's our start point where there isn't much of a gap, and then we roll up and back down. Similarly, when we go to do our bridge, we'll start with arching and flattening the back, or tipping the pelvis forward, tipping the pelvis back, and from that position where the mat is flat on the mat, you can then lift your tailbone up from the lower back to the upper back and holding it there and reversing down. Okay, so tipping the pelvis back, kissing the mat, lifting from the tailbone to the lower back, upper back, onto your shoulder blades, holding it there and reversing down. So that's in the lying position. We're going to move now onto all fours. So just changing up the position, so it just improves your proprioception and body awareness. We're going onto the all fours so that your hands are just slightly ahead of my shoulders and the knees are placed underneath the hips. And we're going to do the same thing here. So my pelvis is here and my tailbone is connected to the pelvis, so sometimes I cue the tailbone to help. And you're going to tuck the tailbone under or tip the pelvis back, and you're going to round into the back. Lovely. And from here, I want you to leave the head where it is and then release. So tailbone to the sky as your pelvis tips forward, arching into the back, and I'm lifting my head. I'm going to tuck the tailbone under. That's the pelvis tipping backwards, rounding into the lower back, and head drops. Lovely rounding through the whole spine. We're going to reverse that now. So I'm going to leave my head here and then let the tailbone come up into the sky. My pelvis is tipping forward, abdomen dropping, standing tall on my hands. I lift my head. And then we're going to come back somewhere into the middle of that. So we're not too rounded and not too arched. So pelvis is lying in the middle so that your head and tailbone are in one line. Okay. So that's that posture, and we worked a little bit on all fours during the week where we did some prep planks. So if you can hold the pelvis relatively in that position or steady enough in that position, then that's a good place to feel the tummy start to work. Then we come up into the standing position. So we do this in the warm-up of some of the classes. So the feet a little bit more than hip width apart. I'm going to do a side view. And we're going to unlock the pelvis by just releasing through the knees and just tilting forward. So this is the pelvis here. My hands are on the top of my pelvis bone. Tailbone is here. Pubic bone is at the front. And you're going to tuck the tailbone between the legs. Pelvis tipping forward. I'm rounding into my lower back. You want the knees to stay steady and the hips to stay where they are. So reverse that, so tailbone can guide you. So tailbone skyward as my pelvis basin tips forward, arching into the low back. And there we go. And reversing that curve again. So tuck the tailbone under, rounding into my low back. That's lovely. Knees are staying steady. They're not gone too far on you. Staying steady here. And then reversing that, so tailbone skyward, arching into the back, your chest can lift, and with the breath in and breathing out, rounding through the tailbone, so my pelvis is tipping back, rounding through the back and sinking in the breastbone, breathing out. So a little tip for that one, if that's hard and you need a little bit of feedback, you can just pop yourself in a perch standing position where you have a bit of support. So I've a chair here with against the wall or the bed so it doesn't go anywhere, where you can use the back of a couch as a nice, or a bar stool. So you want your feet apart again. And it just gives you a little bit of feedback. It keeps the hips steady and the knees steady, so you're not kind of moving back and forth. So just resting onto the chair. And you're going to tuck the tailbone under, so that's my pelvis tipping back, rounding into the back, breath out, and breathing in. Then reverse that, so my tailbone sticking into the air, arching through the back and lifting through your breastbone. And breath in. I'm cueing the breath to go with the pattern of rounding to breathe out and extension with my breath in. That's the natural flow of the breath. So typically your breath will follow the pattern of rounding or flexing to breathe out and breathing in, extension, breathing out to round and breathing in, extension. Okay, so I hope that helps. I've just moved through that pelvic mobility exercise in the lying down position on the all fours and in the standing posture. So just to give you a little bit more insight, and hopefully those tips will help. Thank you.